Good, that's all sorted. Let's go back to Zoom and great. Hello, everybody. We've got a good number of people coming in. We'll just give it a little bit longer.
Yeah, sure.
Welcome, everybody on YouTube. If there's anybody watching the live stream and those of you who watch the recordings, very much appreciate it. We've had some pretty good numbers looking at these amazing series of talks that we call Service Design TV. Broadcasting live today, actually from the Royal College of Art, with real London buses and taxis going by. So that's a good feeling. Terribly for the second year students, this is their last week on campus at the RCA because we do these burst weeks. And this is the last one before they leave. Sorry about that. It's all happened so fast. Anyway, just give it a couple more minutes before we get going, Alex.
Yeah, sure. As I said, you might get my dog punctuating the background. But that's sort of, we've got all of that going on, haven't we?
We can, we're quite happy to start a dog channel as well as a service design channel. Probably, possibly more popular, actually. Brilliant. Okay. So I know some people are on campus and some people are far away. So welcome to people who are watching from far away. I hope it's nice to see London in the background. I have to say it's still quite chilly out, isn't it, Alex? But
it is. It's
getting better.
It's like it's warm in the sun, but I'm sort of sitting in the front room, and yeah, the big jumper had to come out.
Okay, let's kick off. Let's get going. I'm going to ask you, Alex, to tell us about yourselves as we go through here, but just to introduce everyone else to you. I met Alex Hill, gosh, year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. Yeah. And I was undoubtedly a stand-in for more prominent people, but I was very, oh, thank you for recording it. I had the opportunity to meet some amazing people that Alex has brought together and something called the High Performance Roundtable or Forum. And it was extraordinary to talk about what we do in service design to them and to get their reaction to it. And I realized Alex was onto something very interesting here and learned more about his background in leadership, in what makes great leadership and what makes success across all aspects of life, from sport to politics and science. And more recently, Alex has become much more connected to the RCA course and has come in and helped. Certainly those of you in the first year will be quite familiar with Alex by now, as he's helped us understand how to build great teams. And we know that in service design, team building is at the heart of how we collaborate, how we co-create, how we do what we do. So it's this opportunity to talk to Alex and ask him to tell us about some of his background, some of the stories, some of the people he's met, some of the successes he's analysed. I think will be very important for us to hear, especially as I was remarking in the stand-ups earlier this week, increasingly our role as service designers is to lead. And it's not quite the leadership of the CEO, it's the leadership of live day-to-day project transformation, cultural transformation. These are things that we need to understand a bit about performance and leadership. So I think it's fantastic to have you here, Alex. Thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Perhaps I'll simply ask you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, I guess. So I started life managing factories. I worked for a big engineering firm that was a big multinational and spent the first 10 years managing people, really. We were making sort of big, complicated products, often just one or two at a time, that are designed and engineered within very tight tolerances, and sort of sold those around the world. And I I guess I sort of learned how to work with people, how to read people, how to work with customers, how to understand markets, etc., etc. And that 10 years was really my kind of apprenticeship, I guess, in terms of management, for want of a better word. And then I left industry and I went to Oxford University and did research for 3 years, and I did my PhD. And then since that point, sort of have spent life as a sort of an academic, but I also work with firms and businesses and organizations. So I always say I feel like I'm somebody from practice who sits in a university rather than someone from a university who engages with practice. So one of the things I always love about this program and the RCA and the work you do is it's practice-led, and too few academic institutions are these days, and I think that's a real problem. But and then sort of spent 10 years kind of teaching and working with organizations all over the world in different sort of guises, and then sort of hit that midpoint. I think, when you're 20 years into your career, something we talked about, Clive, I sort of believe those first 2 decades, 1 decade to learn your craft, 1 decade to work out what to do with it. I then hit the point where I kind of was like, okay, well, what do I do now? I'm halfway through. When I die, what do I want to leave behind? And my dad has always been a real inspiration to me. I've worked with him a lot and written books and stuff with him. And he's always been pretty good at sort of framing you and saying, okay, what are you doing? Why is it important? Why should anyone care? What's significant? He sort of said to me, what are you going to leave behind? What's your legacy? So he's always pushed my thinking. And I had sort of like a couple of years of reflecting, and then I said, well, actually, what I really love is when people perform at a very high level. I've always enjoyed music, sport, the arts in all different shapes and forms, cooking. I worked in a Michelin star restaurant for a bit. I've always enjoyed being at that moment when it's just all working. And you feel it. There's an energy, there's a synchronicity, there's a moment when it's clicking. Clive, you play on stage. I think that's the perfect example when the band's working and you're having that moment and everything's slightly heightened and it just clicked. So a colleague of mine was doing some work with the Olympic teams, and it was the coming up to the London Games, and he just said, I think something interesting's going on here. Why don't we go in and see what they're up to? So we managed to spend time with a guy called Peter Keane, who developed the investment model for the Olympics. So he developed this way of predicting how many medals a team would win, and then we allocate money based on how many medals they're going to win. So if you're judo and you think you're going to win 3 medals, you get X. If you're taekwondo, you get Y. And essentially, it's what it's allowing athletes to train full time, so they can completely dedicate to their craft. And we spent a day with him, and he talked us through his journey and how he transformed cycling originally, and then worked with the other teams. And I just said, what keeps you awake at night, Peter? And he said, is it sustainable? We've done some great things, but I'm just very nervous that it's all going to crumble. And he went to this big whiteboard, and at the one side of the right whiteboard, he wrote cult. And then at the other end, he wrote sustainable system. And he said, too many of our sports are reliant on 1 or 2 individuals. And if they leave, then it could all disappear. And so I said, well, who do you think you can learn from? And he said, the arts. They've been doing it for hundreds of years. So that's actually when sort of quite a big project around high performance and sustaining success started, which was actually when we got in contact with the Royal College of Arts, the Royal Shakespeare Company, Royal Academy of Music, and then the All Blacks, NASA, and cycling, and Eton, and sort of built up this kind of core group of high performing organizations that have managed to sustain their success for 100 years or more.
That is an extraordinary collection of organizations.
Yeah,
How did you come to?
Yeah, and you've worked with them now, haven't you? I mean, they loved their day with you. So thank you so much for doing that.
Well, it was reassuring, and so many things that you've said, actually, right back from being in a band, that is that creative collaboration, but also the fact that so many organizations pick up on some of these basic tools that we can all share them. They can be useful. I mean, that's a tremendously positive story for all of us in service design. But when you bring all those organizations together, you know, what do you see are the similarities? Does high performance mean the same thing? Is it about that flow or synchronicity, as you say?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's definitely always a performance. You know, I mean, it's a bit like this, isn't it? The fact that this is live, going out on YouTube, you're almost creating a performance. You're creating a stage, and there is that, and there is a publicness to that performance too. So, you know, like the end of year shows that the students are about to go into,
Yeah.
there's sort of a moment.
Theatrical, in fact.
Yeah, there's a moment when you have to get it right, you know, and you feel that. So that's definitely consistent. I think there's also, what we started to notice is that there's some things that don't really change in these organizations, and there are some things that are constantly changing at every minute of every day. And it's actually the balance. It's the balance between the stability and the disruption that's absolutely critical. So for example, you know, from a leadership point of view, there are certain individuals who tend to stay for 10, 15, 20 years. But then, and that tends to roughly be around a quarter of the team. But then there are other individuals who come and go. You know, I mean, if you think about the RCA, the visiting faculty, you know, move in and out all the time, and that creates disruption. You know, it brings the outside in, but it also there's a sense of performance when you come. You know, when I work with your students, there's a sense of, I have to get this right. You know, I've got a moment here to get it right and to nail it, and then I'm going to go away and they're not going to see me for a while. And then when I come back, I've got a moment and I've got to get it right again. So the movement in and out, I think, is really important. So we described it as a stable core and a disruptive edge. And the core guides you, but the disruption moves you.
Gotcha. What about when things go wrong? What about failure? You told me some amazing stories about turning around failures and different ways of doing that. Share some of your, well, it's part of your story, isn't it? A big part of your story, how you analyze that aspect of life.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the service design students, you know, they're going to be going out and changing the world, aren't they? I mean, that's what we all hope. That's why they're here. And so often, you know, I always say to these sorts of people, you're often given things that don't work or problems to fix that others can't solve, you know. So in many ways, actually, they'll probably experience more failure than success. And when it's successful, they'll be asked to go and fix another problem. So that's probably going to be their lives, is understanding and fixing problems. We did a big study looking at schools. And the nice thing about schools is when they fail, they don't disappear. So you can actually understand the recovery that can happen. And we were able to get access to 160 schools' computer systems and staff and faculty and students, etc. And we studied them for 9 years from the point of failure and tried to work out what happened. And when we sat back and looked at all the data, there was a pattern, and different leaders actually behave in different ways. So worryingly, what it showed was that the short-term fixes often aren't sustainable. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, you know, as a designer heading out into the world, trying to rethink it and reshape it and transform it. It can often be very tempting to just fix the immediate problem. But the question is, are you leaving something that's sustainable and more significant behind too? You know, you do need to keep yourself in a job. That's very important, and you will be judged on your performance. And most studies have shown that the 2-year mark is very critical for a senior leader. You know, you can survive a year on a good story, but you can't survive more than 2 years without results. But how do you keep yourself in a job, but then how do you do stuff that has much more long-term impact? I think is a really important question. So I think, you know, when we spoke about before, we gave names to the heads and the leaders we found, which I know is something that you're a big fan of, that sort of personification, Clive.
Exactly. You created personas out of people who had short-term impact, but perhaps weren't sustaining it, and the opposite.
Yeah.
I love you.
And I think what you're doing when you're sharing ideas and you're spreading ideas, you realize you have to help people grab it and remember it. I always think that the test is, can someone remember your idea and tell it to somebody else over dinner?
Indeed.
You know, and are you making it so it's sticky? So the sort of the personification is really important to that. I mean, it meant, because I hadn't quite finished the article when we went on holiday to Cornwall, that I was waking up in the middle of the night writing down different names and then going back to sleep and then waking up and write, you know, and the list was huge, and then you cut some and then you test them out with people, and they like this, but they don't like that. But as you say, we had sort of the short-termists were what we called soldiers and surgeons, and they basically cut. So the soldiers cut staff and costs and tighten things up. So everything looks great short-term, but then when they leave, everything expands and goes back to where it was. The surgeons, in the case of schools, cut students, so they kick out the kids they don't want, and then the results improve. But again, it's very short term. It's very damaging for society. You know, it's not the right thing to do. But I do, you know, from when you're working with organisations that don't have societal impact, often the way to make a company profitable is to stop serving all your unprofitable customers. Often the cutting helps, but it then needs to lead to some investment and some long-term improvement too. The problem with cutting and the benefit of cutting is the impact's immediate. The problem I always think about investing or improving is that the impact can take time, and the impact can be very unpredictable. So that's your challenge. But yeah, so the surgeons cut students, the soldiers cut staff. We had the philosophers who basically talk a great game but don't do anything. We have the accountants that think it's all about money and getting more money and growing the revenue. And then finally, we had the only ones where the school actually continued to improve after they left, which was the architects. And they actually believed the school was about its community and its role in society. And they worked hard to define that and engage local businesses and local people and find the right school for its community. And then they slowly kind of built that up. Interestingly, as well, with the architects, they didn't think the answer was just to find better teachers, which is what the philosophers did. The architects were like, my role as a leader is to shape the environment, to create the right environment, so the right behaviors, the right culture, and then you bring the talent into that, and then it flourishes. Whereas the philosophers thought, you know, bring in great teachers and they'll fix all your problems, but they didn't. They just got very frustrated and left.
Do you think that people's perception of leadership, for example, is they choose surgeons and soldiers because there is an assumption they will be effective? Is it difficult to choose an architect against a philosopher, for example?
I think so. In our study, the surgeons got knighted. The philosophers were loved by their peers at the beginning, at least, because they appealed to them and talked about the importance of teaching. No one really liked the architects, and actually, I mean, in the study, they were the least recognised and the least paid of all the heads, interestingly enough. But they had the smallest egos too. The philosophers would tend to be quite big egos, like the sound of their own voice, very inspirational, inspiring, but didn't ultimately do anything. So we found that people loved the idea of a philosopher because conceptually and theoretically it was so lovely, but in reality it was useless. People loved the immediate impact of the surgeon because they wanted to believe that things could be fixed so quickly. And the architects, it was much more of a battle. It was much more a battle. But there's some lovely quotes we got from the architects, like "No one should notice when I leave the room," which I thought was a lovely quote. "It's not about me; it's about them." So there wasn't a weakness in them, but there was definitely a humility and a thoughtfulness. And one of the best architects, they really wanted to shape society. They really wanted to change society. One of the best architects. So one of the other things you noticed in schools, and I do, although it is schools, I think there's learning for others sectors too, is it was much easier to improve a school in a city than in the countryside. And the reason why was that when a school failed, got taken over and rebranded and relaunched, the middle class parents wanted their kids to go there now. So what you saw was the community the school was serving changed. So the school didn't actually improve, but better kids went there. And you could see that because the ethnicity changed in the school.
Wow.
Generally, interestingly, you don't really want the white British children. They're the hardest to engage and work with because often they've come from 2 or 3 generations where there hasn't been much opportunity. And as you got the sort of first generation, Asian, often African children too, you did start to see things shift and move. But what was interesting was some schools managed that ethnicity change more than others. But you definitely saw in a city that the kids and parents changed. So we measured, for example, how often parents came to parents' evening. And when a school was failing, no parents ever went. As soon as they started to improve, you suddenly got much more attendance.
Signal, an interesting metric, isn't it? That you're making progress.
Yeah, I mean, some of the interesting metrics were like how many sick days does staff take? How often do parents engage with the school? What's the attendance of the students? So there's quite a lot of measures around engagement that you're kind of trying to find.
There seems so many crossovers between the things that you're talking about and the kind of transformation. And I think everybody on this course would say they're trying to save the world, and they generally are. I was talking to some students earlier, and I realized the dichotomy of being in an art and design college where it's all about heroes, it's all about Johnny Ive, and yet I've got quite a few projects that are going to have a major impact, and they're not going to be famous. They're really not, but they're going to hopefully sleep better at night because they've really massively positive impact. But it is a weird thing to be a service designer in an art college where everyone else is going to be a famous designer. And there aren't that many famous service designers, but probably for the better. Now, you did this 9-year study. You then developed that into an output, didn't you, into a report. Talk to us about the story of that.
So I was quite naive going into education. I know your wife, she works in education, doesn't she, Clive? It's a very passionate topic, quite rightly,
Yes.
full of very passionate people, again, quite rightly. And we sort of stumbled into that world a bit naively. The first study we did, which just looked at 8 schools in depth, we sent it to the government and said, look, we think we found some interesting stuff. And we got sort of very sweet email, thanks, but no thanks, basically, keep up the good work type thing. So we created a website and we put the report online. And then it got picked up, edited, snapshotted and shared out on Twitter. And we basically got, I think there was a journalist we were working with at the time, she reckoned we got 20,000 hate mails. And it was basically because we had found that the fastest way to improve a school is to kick out the kids you don't want, but that's not the right solution for society. However, the bit that went out was the first bit, not the second bit. And I think what also we were doing is we were presenting what we found. This wasn't our opinion. This is just the evidence we'd discovered. So we were watching what schools were doing, the academy schools, and we were sharing what they were doing. We weren't saying to do that, but we were saying this is what they're doing, and we think there's some lessons that can be learned, not just for how to improve a school, but for policy and government too, you know. Anyway, we got our fingers burnt, and we realized that if we were going to try and shape society and create impact, you need to control the story, you need to control the dialogue. And what we had done badly was to just put our evidence up, but not tell our story. Yeah.
No.
Sorry?
And you got your 20,000 hate mail.
Exactly. So as we carried on with the research and started to notice that we thought it was around leadership, because there's definitely patterns with different leaders taking different actions for different reasons. We realized that when that came out, we needed to control the dialogue. So we got the article published in Harvard Business Review, which was great. So we got a good output. And then we said, right, we now want to share this. And after we'd been attacked, somebody from Newsnight had got in touch and had been very supportive. So we went back to him and said, could we do something on Newsnight? And he said, yeah, great, we'll do that. And then we sort of set up, I don't know, 3 or 4 different newspaper articles. And we made it so that we delayed it going out to a point when the election actually was over, because the Newsnight person said it will get greater traction if you release it in November rather than September or whatever it was. And we just controlled the dialogue. So what happened was the show went out on Newsnight, and then all 5 articles went out in sort of half an hour after that. And it just created a huge sort of storm on the internet, and the government then got in touch and said, right, you need to come in and talk to us. So sort of I think what we learned was it's better to do a big bang and control that bang and almost control the narrative as much as you can. and then do it in all at once, and then it will kind of disperse around, and it gets people's attention, but also you're not suddenly in this battle where you're having to fight with them around what it is you're trying to say, what it isn't you're trying to say, because you kind of tried to set up that discussion in a more controlled way before it goes out, essentially.
We spend a lot of time here talking about narrative and storytelling, I have to say, because it's kind of the only thing we've got. We don't design chairs or dresses or cars. Second years especially have just spent a lot of time telling their story. And I think that's a brilliant bit of insight you've given us to how incredibly important it is.
What was, just quickly as well, Clive, what was really interesting is of the 5 types we came up with, people only remember the surgeons and the architects. I think that's also something, people will edit your story. And so you almost need to realize that, and they will simplify it. I think is important as it goes. And most of the, I think there was like 200 blogs that appeared around the world, and people were comparing the different types with different football managers. But I think again, you almost, your 2 extremes need to be the most interesting types, because often it's
design that story by understanding where those extremes are and what the simplest message will be taken away.
And how you think somebody might grab it and use it, I think is really important.
Fantastic. That's really good. Looking at my notes here, you talk very entertainingly about Nobel Prize winners. Was that research that you did, or was it research that you came across?
So that's research I've come across for the book, but so the sort of sustaining success article, I'm in the process of making into a book. One sort of looks at these 12 behaviors for sustaining success. One of the behaviors is that you need to bring the outside in, which is this sort of part-time experts that we were talking about. And within the chapter, sort of delved into that in more detail and tried to say, what's an example of a great success where someone's done that very well, a big failure where someone didn't do that, and sort of you're trying to convince people to use part-term expertise and to encourage people to move in and out. And most organizations don't want to do that. They want to own you and put you on one project in one specialism. And I think that's can make you successful for a while, but at some point those people will go out of date, basically. So I think it's a really good question from an organization point of view, but also from an individual point of view, is how do you keep learning and how do you stay relevant and how do you stay at that cutting edge, basically. I think a great example, the example I used in the book of where it went wrong was when the iPhone came out, and BlackBerry just really didn't see it as a threat. So, from their point of view, it's not secure, it uses too much data, and business will never use it. So actually it's just a toy, it's a plaything. And they also just didn't really see the point in apps. So, and they bought out their own touchscreen phone within a year. So they were able to do that, but there were no apps on it. And that was because they didn't open themselves up. And actually, if you go back, the history of the person who kind of set up BlackBerry and developed it, he was used to fixing his own problems and solving his own challenges. And that was the way he always responded, was to go quite insular and to just solve. Whereas I think, what was interesting about the iPhone was that unusually for Apple, they're actually quite open in terms of app development, and encouraged all these people to come in and develop apps for them, much more collaborative than they normally are.
Yeah. No, I love those stories. I mean, I've lived through so many of those stories in my design career. You know, people who just go and solve stuff and they don't understand the real problem. That's why we created our own version of a very handy thing you can draw on a napkin, which is a double diamond design process. And now we're saying, well, maybe we need to be a bit more sophisticated than that, but it's the takeaway you need to stop that kind of myopic thinking, isn't it? But businesses have always done that so much. But you were talking to me particularly about Nobel Prize winners and about what makes a good one.
Yeah, so that was interesting. Again, you know, because I think you're often, well, I am, when you're doing your own work, you're almost looking at quite an isolated case and you're looking for a big picture example to test it, basically. And the Nobel Prize winners are interesting because there's been so much research done where people have literally studied their habits for over 40 years. You know, it's actually a huge study that one group of people did that they then passed on to another group, and it sort of kept that kind of that exploration. But they took, say, I think it's around 500-600 scientists who've won the Nobel Prize now and compared them with 7,000 who haven't, and basically said, what is it that they do differently? And what surprised them was that they all have a very serious hobby that isn't science. So they all get out of their thing, and they all regularly play a musical instrument and practice an art. And they actually talked about how you need to visualize a problem to solve it. And it was the painting or the drawing or the music playing allows a visualization of an idea. And through the visualization, they could then spot the connections and the patterns and start to, you know, come up with something different. So, and they also talked about the need to have time away from what you do to rethink what you do. So, and how it was often when you're trying to solve another problem that you rethink your original problem, because, you know, the brain's working away even though it's not consciously doing that, and almost you're reframing or reshaping your thought process, and then suddenly you spot something. So the lady who's just won the Nobel Prize for editing genes talked about how the ideas came from contemporary dance. You know, she's always done a lot of contemporary dance and learning patterns and dance moves, and that editing process was how she then cracked editing the genes. So, but interestingly, the scientists who don't win the Nobel Prize just do science. So actually, it's this idea of early specialization isn't good long term. Yes. If you want to be someone who creates breakthroughs and transformations, then actually you need quite a breadth of experience early on, because the breakthroughs normally come from patterns. Yes. You know, they come from an idea here going to here. You know, and it's that classic. You know, if you look at most of the big Silicon Valley companies, they've done that. You know, you've taken a touch screen that existed for decades and just put it into a phone, or you've taken a battery and, you know, put it into a car or whatever it is. You're making something that already exists but putting it into a different context.
The intersection, isn't it? It's the intersection I think is interesting. We often have this conversation, especially with first year students who come in and want very deep technical knowledge. And I think, you know, the technical knowledge we give are the tools of service design, but you can apply them anywhere. And I personally really massively believe that, because then you create your own intersections almost by your naivety, by coming in and having the tools to uncover and redefine and reframe. You don't necessarily have the skills, but you have the skills that are different to the surgeon or indeed the Nobel Prize winner.
Exactly. I mean,
great thing. It's quite a troublesome thing to embrace.
It is. And again, you know, sort of coming back to these high-performing organizations, they look for it and they embrace it. I mean, so the big shift in the British cycling was when they got the aerodynamicist from Lotus cars to come in for a day and he put Chris Broadman, who's the cyclist, in a wind tunnel and just made him sit in really weird positions. And Broadman talks about how he was like, I can't sit like that. You can't, no one ever does that. That's weird. And then he started taping bits of cardboard to him, and that's basically where that weird position, how now they lean their arms on the front and they wear that sort of that big hat. And it's a much sort of, the seating positions like this. So it's much higher at the back. They basically reduced his drag by a quarter in 2.5 hours of playing around with different ideas. But, a cyclist would never have come up with those ideas because they're so fixed in what they thought a bike should be, a helmet should be, a seating position should be.
Well, that is a nice segue into, you run this other sort of venture called Radical Traditional. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
I didn't talk about that before, but since you've mentioned that, inability to change, I'd love you to talk a little bit about what's behind that concept and what is that about?
Yeah, actually, the phrase came from Paul Thompson, when we were having a meeting, and I said, how would you describe the RCA? And he said, he used the phrase radical traditionalism. I've just kind of shortened it slightly. But it is this idea of how you old and new at the same time. And the thing I think is, when you are working with successful organizations, is how can you improve them without destroying them? I think is really your kind of question, sort of think, what do you need to protect and safeguard? And then what do you need to change and shift? And it's almost easier when it's a disaster and it's failing and nothing's working, because you can kind of try everything and see what works and then move forwards. I think it's much harder when something is already very good to work out how to improve it, but you have to, if you want to sustain success, that's what you have to do.
I was talking to the European Broadcasting Organisation yesterday, who were talking about the difficulty of having public sector broadcasting survive the Netflix, Amazon, Disney age, and they have to do something. And it's interesting that BBC is seen as one of the few people that did flex into digital. Yeah. Actually have an incredible design tradition that they've created as a result, but they were luckily able to keep their heritage, but bring in that transformational revolution as well. But it's so difficult for people, isn't it?
It is, and I think because there are, so many examples of where it's destroyed what was great through that radical, transformation. Yeah. But equally, there's so many examples of organizations that haven't made the leap because they're so nervous about changing anything. So, the question is, how do you do both? And it comes back to this sort of stable core and disruptive edge that we were talking about earlier. And what we found, that the stability is your purpose, your stewardship, and your openness. So that's something we found needs to always be there. And it's interesting, I think, when things aren't working or you've hit a bump in the road, we found that these great organizations always go back to the purpose first. So they're like, what are we about? How do we impact the world? How do we shape society? The Royal Institution is interesting. We did a sort of a series, sort of podcast series for Amazon Audible, and the Royal Institution was one of them. And they hit a massive problem. They're a very interesting institution. They're the first one-way street in London because their talks were so popular. They had to put a one-way street in. Their whole sort of heritage. How do you use science to help society, basically? And it's sort of the early talks of Darwin and sort of that group were all there. But they overspent on refurbishment. They got into financial problems. They went bankrupt, and they had to kind of re-emerge as a, with a 200-year heritage behind them. How did they re-emerge? And they actually went back to the founding document that had been put in place by, I think it was Michael Faraday who originally helped. And they looked at the wording, and they basically looked at the wording is to help use science to improve society, basically. And then they used that as a way to just sort of test everything they were doing and said, is this working? Is this helpful? Is this useful?
That's wonderful. So they managed to keep those sort of principles, but apply it in a different way.
Yeah, because I think their view was that the principles were still sound.
Yeah.
They just got distracted, or they had maybe not been at the cutting edge anymore. They'd lost their they got a bit soft, they hadn't really pushed things in the way that they once did.
Go against it though, can't it? The American Constitution seems to have a different version in every individual's head.
Yeah.
Or different interpretations. So you've got to be reasonably explicit about what your principles are, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think most organizations I've worked with that perform at a very high level talk a lot about behaviors. So they will take that purpose and then they will say, okay, on a day-to-day basis, what does that mean in terms of how we behave with each other and to the rest of the world? And they're very, very explicit about that. I mean, the All Blacks, are a good example of, again, where they call them massive disasters. To the rest of the world, they're not, because if they lose 2 games in a row, that's a complete disaster, whereas most of their peers rarely win 2 games in a row.
If you don't know, we're talking about the New Zealand rugby team.
Yes. And they, they're very, and they're the sport's interesting because they have these sort of turns of phrases, but they have a very clear no dickheads policy, and that's stated.
I wish English football teams had that. That'd be amazing.
But there's things like, there's a great book called Legacy that sort of fleshes out some of these, but they sort of sweep the sheds. They all take it in turns to sweep the sheds. They actually have a lot of Maori culture in them, which is interesting. So, for example, in the Maoris, there's no word for mum or dad. There's just a collective word for somebody who looks after you, because aunts, uncles all look after each other's children, and that's how the tribe is brought up. So there's sort of principles like that they apply. But yes, they're very clear on what behavior should be, on what's good behavior and what's not good behavior.
By the way, if anyone's got some questions, if you want to think about some questions for Alex, either drop them in the chat, or I can come off our spotlight function in a minute so we can see everybody. But we're getting towards the latter part of this hour. I sort of want to ask you, Alex, who's the most impressive team or most impressive organisation or even most impressive individual you've come across that we could learn from? It's an unfair question because I didn't prime you for it.
No. I don't think there's one.
No.
I think what there is there is a pattern. So I found that I was meeting the same person in every organization, and that really surprised me. So I've met a lot of Clives. I've met a lot of people like you in these organizations who I think are deeply curious, incredibly open, slightly unaware of how good they are. I think there's definitely a nervousness in a lot of the individuals. So like Peter, for example, you know, who took us from our worst Olympic performance ever to being the first country to do better after a home games.
Amazing.
And to win the most medals of any country if you take the Paralympics and the Olympics together, which is just phenomenal, you know, given where you're competing with people like, you know, America and China, who have a lot more resources. And he spent the whole day saying, what have I missed? I've missed something, haven't I? He was so worried and he's never the one that gets written about in the books or the press.
No.
I
never heard it until you mentioned him.
Yeah, he flies under the radar because I think he finds the responsibility of it all quite stressful. But that creates his sort of nervousness, and there's like a disruptive nervousness that keeps him moving and thinking and learning and all those sort of curiosity. And so that's something that I just found that. And I mean, I spend a lot of time working in business and with businesses, and a lot of those people are very closed. So, you know, you throw an idea at them and the first thing they do is tell you why it won't work or how they've tried it before, or how, well, we're not a sports team, or we're an American company, not a British company, or, you know, whatever it is. They almost search for reasons to not be curious. And I think that the great people are just incredibly curious and open and just lovely, actually lovely people.
Well, that's brilliant, because you just described everybody on the service design course. So that's just perfect. Anybody got any questions? Anyone want to jump in? I can't see if anyone's got their hands raised at the moment. So just shout if you wish to, otherwise I'll keep going. And we're nearly near the end, I think, aren't we? Let's have a look. Yeah, we've just got five minutes left. You've worked with the students here. You've been, you know, quite involved, especially with the first years, helping people think about teams, helping think about working with each other. I think people find it difficult, you know, and quite unusual. Again, it's back to this art perception of we're all sort of going to be inspired on top of a mountain or in the shower, and yet we fervently believe creativity is much more collaborative, and actually there are great benefits. I mean, do you have any observations or tips really for the students here going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting, isn't it? I had a call with a investment bank last week. I was speaking to one of their senior people who's actually a very interesting person. And he said how he'd noticed that all of his big ideas came when he was going for a walk, or when he was playing sport, or when he was doing something, much like the Nobel Prize winners. And he said, I came to the conclusion that I just can't let that be a chance process. I can't let that randomly happen. I need to design it in. So he said, what I do now is I have time every day when I sit at the kitchen table with no distractions and just think. And he said, and he said, it's very stressful at the beginning because you don't really know what you're doing or why you're doing. But actually, I've discovered that when I clear the space, then the ideas start to come. And I think creativity can be accidents, and often is accidents, and it often is a nervousness or a hanging out or a bumping here or a bumping there. But I think it can be designed in. I think you can encourage it, and you can make time for it and make space for it. And I think I would just encourage people to experiment and try different ideas, but then make time in their day to learn or to find new stuff. I think the problem with lots of organizations is they focus on efficiency, and efficiency is really just doing what you already know as quickly or with as less resources as possible. Whereas actually you won't find anything new by doing things that way. So it's often counterintuitive, and you must know this too, Clive, particularly when you're very busy, to make time to not do anything.
Yes.
Do what you're meant to be doing is hard, but without that, you won't actually find anything new. You'll just be doing emails or what have you.
I'm a tremendous hypocrite. I spend a lot of time training organizations and telling them to put their emails down. And, we do exercises like Crazy Eights, where you have 8 ideas in 8 minutes. And then we have 4 more ideas as well. And teams of 5 in 12 minutes have had 60 ideas. But do I do that myself? Never. So we do need, and I do say to people, you've got to put your, business as usual is the great enemy, I think, of creativity and just thoughtfulness, just trying to understand what's going on and see where the big things are, and yet we're very bad. And sometimes that's not just time, it's place as well, going to a different place, something we encourage a lot of people to do. But again, I forget. We've got a couple of questions just before we sign off here.
Sure.
Alex has, both questions I think are entirely facetious. What is one good way to find uncertainty and disagreement? Well,
I think that's important. So if we think about the successful organizations that sustain success, there is which we talked about earlier, this idea that they perform in public. And what that means is they actually invite scrutiny and pressure. They often invite it from people who won't tell them they're doing a good job. They look at what they do and ask themselves, what don't we know that we need to know, and who knows that, and how can we get them to talk to us or to watch us or to challenge us? Now, I think you have to have quite a lot of confidence in yourself and your abilities to be that open. But it's amazing when you do bring in people who will see things differently, what they start to see. And often it's actually not always the negative, it's often the positive too. They'll sort of see something that they think is brilliant that you can't see.
Of course, it brings us back to diversity as well. It's well researched and proven that diversity drives innovation and better success. And I've certainly worked in lots of organisations where they always recruit exactly the same people.
Yeah.
It's just.
I mean, again, we had another example with the British cycling team when the head coach said, I got very nervous when everyone was agreeing with each other. And he said, and it wasn't long before our performance dipped. The performance fell, and so he said, I mixed the team up, and we had more arguments, and then performance went back up again.
I definitely feel students feel uncomfortable with disagreement when actually we should probably be embracing it and using it to drive an even better solution.
I think it's a learning process. It was for me. I don't know about you, Clive, but early on I didn't really like it, and then with experience I've realized it actually massively improves what I do. So I still don't like it, but I do encourage it, and I've learned that actually my work and my ideas they're not really as good as they could be or they should be until somebody else has ripped them apart.
Yes, which you do brilliantly to my ideas. So thanks for that, Alex. I think, and by the way, Avocado has many design ideas this term. When taking a shower, does it make you Archimedes? I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
We're going to have to draw a line. There was any closing comments, Alex? Sorry.
I mean, I've said this to the second year students in particular when we spoke, is just really, really important that you go off and do something important. And we had the conversation, that sort of, I like that notion of look at your career as 4 decades.
Yes.
1 decade to learn your craft, 1 decade to work out what to do with it, 1 decade to change the world, and 1 decade to give back. So don't be in a hurry to change the world. That's going to come, but realize that ultimately is what we need you to do. Society needs bright, curious people like the students on this program to do something really important. Otherwise the world won't evolve and improve. So, but don't rush there. Don't go for the big fancy job with in the fancy, shiny building with the nice big title. I remember when I worked in industry, it was a real struggle for the people who went to head office first, because head office, was nicer than everywhere else. But they didn't really learn much in head office. They learned how to spend time with people who thought they were important, but they didn't really learn their craft. So I think, my advice would be to don't go to the big consultancies. You do it if you really want to, but for a short period of time, because you won't learn about change. You often, your job will finish with a nice report and a fancy presentation. And really you want to learn how to make things better and different. And don't go to head office, go and get your hands dirty, and just learn. Just, that those first 20 years are all about learning. And if you're not learning, then you need to move or try something different or keep going. And that really has got to be your focus. And then do something truly transformational, later on. And I think that's just really important. Again, coming back to Nobel Prize winners, they're in their 50s and 60s when they win. They don't win early on. There's a couple of rare examples, but that was sort of much earlier, sort of when the prize had only just come out. But these days they tend to be in their 60s mainly, because it just takes time to get to that stage where you can do something really big and important.
Okay, Alex, apologies to Alessandro with your raised hand, but I'm meant to be in another meeting now, and probably lots of other people are as well. Alex, thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed that. You're getting some nice comments in the chat already, which is nice. But it's nice to talk about something not entirely related, but of course, completely related to what we do. Yeah. So I really appreciate it. And we really appreciate all your contribution to the course now and in the future.
Yeah, no, pleasure. I absolutely love working with them. They're a great bunch of students. It's a real pleasure.
And Alessandro, definitely you can ask your question to Alex. We'll connect you up and you can ask it that way. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Alex. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, likewise.
See you. Thanks a lot.
Clive, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Alex. Let's just check everybody's. Try and get rid of the spotlight that I put on you. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Oh, now I'm the spotlighted one. That's even worse. So, gallery view, quick. Great. Thanks, everybody. Yes, thanks so much for that. That was fantastic. I've got to go to another meeting, so I'm going to have to.
No worries. Alessandro, did you want to?
Yes, quickly, just a personal question. Something that Max.
I'm going to say goodbye, Alex. Thanks very much, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Clive. Bye.
What I wanted to ask is a is something that has to do, that nags me whenever I develop a new idea. After finishing a new project, sometimes I think of the earlier ones, like the first projects I did, either as a student or as an early professional. And I think that with the new skills earned, I could do them better. But another part of me says, well, you did them at the best of your ability with the skills you had previously had. Of course, you can always do better. There's no point in always going back and redoing something over and over again. It's better to just move forward and try something new every single time. Do you think it's worth sometimes re-exploring an old project? Not an old idea. Ideas can be made multiple times. What I mean is literally a project, like a remake.
If there's learning, yeah, totally. I mean, I think one of the example I've got is, so when I worked in a factory, there's some products that we would make thousands of a day.
Mm-hmm.
And you're able to learn because you're basically doing the same stuff all the time. And so you can really get it right. Other things you just do once or twice. And I think the question is, how do you learn when you're not doing something time and time again? And I think there's a few things. One is to go back to the project and debrief it. So there's a reason why NASA will spend 2 years debriefing a mission, because they want to extract as much learning as possible from that event. But I think what you've also got to say with something like that, they've got lots of simulators that allow them to try stuff and experiment. And often what you need to do is to try and create space in your work or your non-work where you can experiment and learn, where actually the risk of failure or the impact of failure isn't too huge. And sometimes that can be your old projects, because it can allow you to kind of go back and rethink it or rework it or try it out again. But there's obviously a balance. You do have to move forwards too. You can't look backwards all the time. But I do think if there's an opportunity to learn and to create learning that you can take forwards, then yeah, I think that makes sense.
The reason I asked is because, the biggest example that comes to mind is probably, even if it's a bit wrong because it's not the same, it's the movie industry, where I sometimes see remakes or even, but that's the perfect example because it expects to be an improvement over the original, but a lot of times, even in other sectors, it's an excuse to go back and do something that's already been done and cash in on some easy success. And oftentimes changes are made which are unnecessary, which damage the product, which was done in a specific way because it worked that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so for me, I think you need to ask why you're doing it. What are you adding? Taking the movie as an example, are you taking it to a new audience? Are you telling the story in a different way that creates different meaning? I think just redoing something exactly how you did it before can be questionable. It was something like that. There's a difference between training and performing. Training is just there is where you actually do something over and over and again, trying to get better. And the performance is then when you sort of create something that matters and release something. So releasing a film is like releasing a performance. I think Pixar are a good example. I don't know if you've read Ed Catmull's book. which I definitely would recommend if you like movies.
Yes, I will sign it down.
Yeah, so Ed sort of set up Pixar with, well, I can't remember what it's called. It's got a red cover with Buzz Lightyear on the front. But anyway, he talks about when they went to do Toy Story 2, because they were asked by Disney to do 3 films. They did Toy Story 1, and then they got them to do Toy Story 2. And they were just going through the motions and trying to make money. And then they went, we can't do that. And then they basically completely worked day and night to actually make it more cutting edge. And I think Toy Story is a good example of where actually they sort of got better each one. And they talk a lot in that about how you're always trying to find a new story and tell it in a different way. And there's some really interesting ideas in the book about how they kind of work and how they do that. But I think if you want to be a cutting edge person, then you do need to keep moving forwards.
Okay.
If redoing what you've done helps you move forwards because you do it in a different way or better, or it's just for learning, it's the training rather than the performance, then definitely worth doing. But you know, I think the most interesting people often, particularly when they're successful, they won't repeat. You know, so David Bowie's a good example of where he sort of kept moving every 3 years, and it was normally when he had his most successful album or single that he made his biggest change. But that will be your challenge as an individual, is most people will want you to just do what you just did.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, that is, I know it seemed like a simple question, but you know, sometimes they say there's always time, you can always improve yourself, but sometimes the best way of improvement, I guess, it's just moving forward.
I think you have to work out whether your time, because producing a film is different to learning how to make a film and learning how to make better films. I think sometimes going backwards and redoing is a learning process. I wouldn't encourage you maybe to make the same film over and over again unless you're doing it for a reason and there was learning from it that would create something different, something else.
Okay.
It's the whole, do you aware of all the stuff around deliberate practice and 10,000 hours? I mean, there's the whole sort of work that's been done looking at the great people and how they actually do deliberate practice for 10,000 hours, which is normally 10 years, to get really good at something. So there is, if you're learning your craft and you're working out what to do, then maybe there's usefulness in repeating. But I think the things that you launch into the world should be different each time.
Very well. Okay. Then I'll be sure to keep that in mind.
Cool.
Thank you very much for staying the extra time just to answer this question of mine.
No worries. Nice to speak to you.
Nice to speak to you too. Good day.